and we've got a good bit to talk about today. So we're in our second week of Revelation. I mean, last week, very short recap, we talked a little bit about some of the interpretive problems of Revelation. We talked about who wrote it. Don't worry, it's St. John. St. John, the apostle whom Jesus loved, wrote it. We talked about when it was written, and our best understanding of when it was written is somewhere between AD 90 and the turn of the second century. So before the second century, John, in his very old age, in exile on the Isle of Patmos, receives a vision from God, vision from his victorious Lord, to comfort him, that he then shares with the entire church as a means of divine comfort. And again, if we think of this book, it is about the end times, absolutely. But we also want to make sure that we don't miss that it is about the end times because it's a letter of pastoral comfort, right? It's a pastor, in this case, John is a bishop. It is a bishop's letter to the whole church, comforting them as they're being slammed by persecution from the Emperor Domitian, who was kind of running a really upping the emperor worship cult that was alive and well at the time. And Christians were getting pounded by it because they refused to worship the emperor and were being put to death for that failure. So, a lot of stuff going on here, and we'll kind of get into that. But before we kind of jump into actually interpreting the book for ourselves, again, I don't want anyone to assume that my position comes from just my own learning or knowledge. One of the great things about being an Anglican is that we have full access into the entire church's history of interpretation of this book, right? And so we should avail ourselves of the different ways in which this book has been interpreted. Some of these are rather new, I mean, kind of in the history of the church, and we'll talk about what they are. And then I'll kind of let you know which one that we will be utilizing as sort of our lodestar. We'll still be referring back to some of these as we go along, but it's good to kind of know where people are coming from when they come to interpret this book. Because one of the real fallacies of biblical interpretation is when someone says, I'm not using a school of thought, I'm not using a lens to look through this book, this is just the Bible. This is just Bible all day long, right? I'm just reading the Bible and this is all it means. That is never how anyone interprets anything. Whenever we interpret something, we are always bringing our whole past to the interpretive process. Presuppositions, ideas we have, all of that comes in whenever we come in contact with a text, right? So we have to, the best thing isn't to kind of go in blank and kind of eyes shut and ears closed. The best thing we can do, and one of the real gifts of being part of a 2,000-year-old church, is we can take advantage of all of the giants and saints who've come before us who have spent their entire lives thinking about this book and have been in conversation with all the saints who have lived in the church, right? And I use that term saint very broadly, right? All the members of Christ's church who have wrestled with these texts, we can have valuable conversation with them within that. So that's an important thing for us to think about. So we're not going into this sort of just saying, I hope the text speaks to me as I read it. We're going in much more saying, well, what are the ways in which this has been done, and what can we learn from others who've come before us, which, again, is the best way for us not to make a mistake. The mistake of going at it without knowing some of these things is that we come up with a novel interpretation or interpretation that we haven't heard before, and we think, oh, I've discovered the secret to Revelation. When in fact, hundreds of people before us have seen this, people have discussed it and found out all sorts of reasons why this doesn't make any sense, right? That's important for studying any text. The Bible, as literature, has to be studied in that way too. Never forgetting that it's also revelation from God, right? Okay, so some ways to interpret Revelation. These terms are not my own. They're sort of the way the field is talked about. So the first one we want to talk about is the preterist position. You don't find this too often, but you will run into people who are hardcore preterists. And for preterists, Revelation is a prophecy of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, and so everything in the book has already happened. Right? So run that through your. I mean, this is at first glance, this is a pretty strange position. So the entire book of Revelation is a symbolic vision of the persecution of the church in the first centuries, and then it ends with the temple being destroyed in AD 70. End of book. Pretty wild, right? And at first glance, there are obviously going to be some problems with this position. One is that an inherent idea in this is that whenever Babylon is mentioned in the book, it's talking about unfaithful Israel, right? It's talking about those who haven't, the Jewish people who haven't accepted the Messiah, right, as Lord and Savior. Nowhere does that happen, though, in any Jewish or Christian literature. There's no place in which you would call Israel Babylon. It's a very weird thing to do. Remember, Babylon is the historic enemy of Israel. Babylon destroys the temple, right? The temple wasn't destroyed by the unfaithful Israelites. Who destroyed the temple? Rome, right? So that doesn't make any sense just right there. So it has some real problems. It also assumes that the judgment that is put down is not a universal judgment, but a judgment against unfaithful Israel. Right? So if the destruction of the temple, this being the thesis here, if all this is about the destruction of the temple and the punishment of the generation of unfaithful Israel who do not follow the Messiah, then why do we need it? Why does the original audience need it? Right? Because if this book is written in AD 90 after the temple is already destroyed, why would he be writing a book about the temple being destroyed? Why would he be writing a book? Who is this book for then, right? It can't be for us, or it can't be for them, so it's kind of for no one. It's all sort of meant for us to kind of look at kind of a paradigm of how things work out and give us no sense of where we are in redemptive historical story. So it's a really strange thing. This can get really weird, too, because really hardcore preterists will tell you that you're in the kingdom of God right now. Like, this is the new heaven and new earth. Hope you enjoy it. Like, so like really hardcore preterists will do stuff like, like, they're also oftentimes big time, doomsday survivorists, right? Because if you're in the new heaven and new earth, then you better grab, have your survival silo if anything goes wrong, because you got to defend your new heaven, new earth that you're in. Like, it gets pretty wild, right?
Why is there still death?
It's a lot of this. There are explanations within this system, but none of them are very good. I mean, it basically comes down to sort of a spiritual idea of being in a new heaven and new earth rather than being physical. And anyone who's read 1 Corinthians 15 immediately should pop in their minds like, well, Paul seems to be telling the Corinthians not to believe that the new heaven and new earth has come yet, that it's in the future, and it will be signified by the general resurrection of all people, which obviously hasn't happened. So this falls apart.
And Jesus comes back too.
Right. I mean, yeah, exactly right. It gets pretty weird. So the idea here being that Jesus kind of has come back, and you're in the world after that. So this is a pretty strange view. Again, held by people. I had a friend in seminary whose father-in-law was an enormous preterist, and it just made him crazy. But again, it's out there and it's a position. You have a slightly modified version of this in which it's actually about the Roman Empire. So Babylon becomes the Roman Empire, and then the book ends when the Roman Empire falls in 476. The Western Roman Empire falls in 476 AD. Again, we run into the same problem. Like, who is this for? How is that relevant? Where is the universal judgment of all men that's prophesied in Daniel? I mean, if we want to think of the book that is our best interpretive guide for understanding Revelation, Daniel is our book. I mean, again and again, John introduces the book, as we'll talk about, in the same way Daniel introduces prophecy, right? And Daniel is all about the entire world being judged by God. So where is that if it all happened in 476? Okay, so I don't have to spend much time on this one. This one's pretty sort of face value, pretty ridiculous. But you will hear people argue this, and so I don't want you blindsided by that when someone's like, "Oh, geez, I've never heard of that before. Is this the secret key to Revelation?" No, it's not. It's bad stuff, right? It's pretty bad. Okay. The next couple, I would also say, are flawed, but they're closer to the kind of they have some important truths within them, right? I think even with the preterist system, the temple falling is a big deal. I don't want us to understand that's not a big deal. Prophesied by Jesus, an enormous deal that happened. but it's not the end of the world. Right? Right? Okay. So historicis. In this, the symbolism of Revelation refers to a series of specific historical events. And almost universally, they always are in the history of the Western church or the European church. Right? So what you end up with the historist view is you get like, maybe you've seen this before, like a bulletin board or like a PowerPoint or a piece of paper, and they start taking things from Revelation saying, well, this is talking about when the Western Roman Empire fell. This is talking about the Nazis. This is talking about this. This is talking about that. This is talking about that. So it says that when the scrolls open, the bowls, the lamps, everything else is a literal talking about specific historical events in history. This is the historicist view. You'll even get things like, oh, this is talking about the Pope. Like, this is the rise of the papacy. Here it is. Boom, we've got it in Revelation. There are some problems with this view, as I would say. The real danger is that, as we kind of talked about a little bit last week, but it's important here for us to keep mentioning this, our interpretive lens for Revelation, because we all bring one, right, needs to be the Bible itself, not our experiences. And not the experiences of our generation or the generation before. Our interpretive lens has to be the Old Testament, right? Because that's the legend, that's the key that John's using, right? It would be like us looking at a map and taking away the legend at the bottom and just trying to write our own and then hoping we could use the map. Right? We might get to the destination, but it's going to be a hard road. That's what happens when, instead of using the Old Testament as our guide, and of course the rest of the New Testament as well, but the Old Testament specifically as our guide, and instead go, well, yeah, this has to be, this has to be, so somebody's rebuilding the Babylonian kingdom. That must be what's going on here. There's a big thing when I was younger that Saddam Hussein was going to rebuild the Babylonian kingdom. This was going to bring the end of the world. Well, Saddam Hussein went in a spider hole and dragged him out, and he got hung by his own people. What happens to that prophecy then? Does that make sense? No, what ends up happening is someone just goes, oh, well, that prophecy was wrong. Our bad. Let's go find a new one and just sort of try to plug it in and make it fit. And again, it gets to be pretty silly. If all of it is, it tends to make us the stars of the book of Revelation. So the book of Revelation inevitably becomes about us. So we are the last generation, right? This is it. Because look, I've got a chart that shows you all the things that are happening. This is it. It's happening right now, and you're the star of the show. So get excited. Like, well, no. The half-truth there is, of course, the book of Revelation is a book about the church of all ages. It is a book about Christ's victory over evil and what that means for us. But it isn't sort of a slideshow of our family vacation that we're then walking through, right? It's not like that at all. And the problem with that is, what comfort could a person in the first century, who Paul's writing to, the 7 churches that are under intense persecution, what could they possibly gain from knowing that, or any comfort they could gain from knowing that, oh, don't worry, in the 21st century, Father Tarsitano is going to be the star of Revelation, and it's all going to turn out all great, right? There's no sense there in that, or of any age. You can pick an age, because all these systems tend to really tend to focus on, particularly the modern ones, you'll find a lot in the 20th century. It becomes really super important, right? And the 20th century is important, right? But so was the 19th century, and the 18th century, and the 17th century, and all the other centuries, and the centuries that are going to go on after us if Christ doesn't return tomorrow, right, or the next year, or 2,000 years from now, right? They're all important, right? And it's not about us. But again, that's a really strong temptation to try to personalize the Bible. And when we see things, instead of going, well, I wonder what Old Testament context this has, instead we go, boom, I got it. I know what's happening because I saw something in the newspaper the other day that sort of looked like this. It's a very dangerous way to interpret. Lonnie.
It was, you said about the 20th century. It was really easy then because Israel became a nation. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Most people jumped on the back.
Oh, yeah.
Now we can figure out when it's going to happen.
We're going to get to that in our next section, but you're absolutely right, because these two are a little related.
Yeah.
The historist and the futurist. The historist kind of thinks you're living through Revelation right now, which again, we're gonna argue, it's true, but it isn't saying that you're like Nostradamus and you're like just like throwing out predicting events and this is what they're all going to look like that, because that's not how prophecy works in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, right? It is talking about real things, but it's not concerned with making a sort of roadmap for us, right? Because it's got to be a book that has comfort for thousands of years, right? Not just us. Every generation of Christians who's ever lived is meant to get comfort from this book. How long would this book be if he's like mapping out every two things up, and then Joe Smith is going to win the lottery on April 5th, 1956, and that's like, no, come on. That's not what this book is about. It'd be impossible to write a book like that anyway.
Or there's trouble in the Middle East.
There's always trouble in the Middle East. Always trouble in the Middle East, yes? I mean, exactly right. And again, you sort of get the sense in some of these systems, the same way that kind of a fortune teller will like pull data out of you, like, do you have somebody in your family with the first name D? Oh my gosh, my brother Dan, how did you know? You're amazing. It tends to feel the same way when you hear these things. Wow, you nailed it. Because human beings want patterns, right? There's a sense that people have said this, neuroscientists and have said this for years, that human beings, we try to make patterns out of everything. And so this really scratches that itch in a big, big way. All right. So now to get to the futurist position, which is a fun one. So it's sort of the exact opposite of the preterist position. Like everything's in the past, don't worry about it. The futurist position is everything's in the future. Right? It's all this whole, but basically after chapter 3, for some reason, once Paul gets done saying this is a letter to specific people in a specific time, boom, then it's all deep into the future, and it's all about the end of history. Right? This becomes a thing, which is fascinating to consider how widespread it is. But this becomes a thing in about 1854 when John Nelson Darby starts writing, he's an English nonconformist, creates a system that's popularly known as dispensationalism. Classical dispensationalism is the one we'll focus on, the one most people believe. We can talk a little bit about the progressive form, but classical dispensation. So how does classical dispensation work? If you again, this is all over our world in the South especially, but in America it's a big thing. This is not a thing it's hilarious. You read European scholars, you read all over the world. This is not a thing in their wheelhouse. It's created in England, but it's not a thing in England. Why? Well, because it becomes a big thing in America due to the Schofield Reference Bible, which came to America, and Schofield was an enormous dispensationalist. And it was one of the first Bibles you could buy that had notes in it, right? So the idea was to sort of explain the Bible for you as you were going through. Before then, how was your Bible explained to you? It was done through your church, right? You were with a group of people. You were together, right? That's how you talked about the Bible. But now you could sit and you could just do your own thing. And the Schofield Bible notes were incredibly big in America. It also sort of became, when the sort of fundamentalist progressive war starts in the early 20th century, this became one of the things that marked you as a fundamentalist. And again, I don't use that term as a pejorative. That was the literal name of the group because there was a series of books that came out called The Fundamentals. And if you held to those books, you were considered a fundamentalist. It was a term, a real term. Yes?
Just want to make a point on Schofield.
Yeah.
People that haven't read that novel or looked at it, it's painstaking notes, like you said.
Yes.
And the amazing thing that I found in several spots, because I bought them.
Oh, yeah, no. They're everywhere. Yeah. You can still buy them.
And it was amazing that he had faith that the Jews were going to all get back together.
Right.
You mentioned that. And I mean, there was no way you could look at that.
Sure.
And picture it.
And this is you're exactly right, Lonnie. And there was a big moment in the mid-20th century where people were like, boom, this is it.
Yeah.
Right? 1947, the nation of Israel, after the Holocaust, nation of Israel is created, and this must be what this system's talking about. So between 47 and now, you've seen this thing kind of explode, partially because they're like, boom, I got it, right? This is it. This is what we're talking about. And that's why, let's go through the classical system, and we'll talk about it. It always starts with this, Israel is given back its historic land.
Yeah.
right? So Israel's given its historic land. Then what happens after that is the church is raptured into heaven and kept out of all the bad stuff that happens in Revelation, right? There's a 7-year tribulation. You then have the reign of the Antichrist begins. The nations gather together to war against Jerusalem. Christ returns, defeats the nations, and then you have Christ rules through a millennium time period, and then there's a last big battle between Christ and the devil, and then the eternal reign begins. So it's a linear system. What it comes from taking the narrative of Revelation and reading it in a chronological linear style, which is, as we will argue, and as I mentioned last week, the problem with that is that you're bringing an interpretation to that ignores the genre in which you're operating, right? If we're actually operating in Jewish apocalyptic style, apocalypse means revelation, it's the genre of the book. If we're operating in that world, then reading it chronologically and laterally is not the way in which you read prophecy of this nature. The way it's read is as recapitulations. So think about it, instead of being a long linear cycle, it's you changing positions to look at the same thing in different places. So you're getting different perspectives on the same events that are happening over and over and over again in different symbols in different ways. Right? This was described to me once by a seminary professor I had, and stuck with me ever since, that one way to think about this is as every time there's a movement in the book, you're getting closer to the throne of Christ. That the movement of the book is not necessarily from now to the end of the world. It talks about those things, but again, it does it a bunch of different times. Like the world ends, and the world ends again. And why is it? You really have to force the linear system in to make it work. What's going on? It's because you're experiencing these things and getting closer and closer to the throne. Because the purpose of the book is to remind us again and again and again, not that we'll all be okay at the end of the world, right? No, that Christ is on the throne, and that anything that happens to us from now until then is within his divine providence. That's right? So whether it's Domitian killing you, the Emperor Domitian killing you, whether it's the Nazis rounding you up, whether it's your country itself turning on you and murdering you, anything that can happen within that, Christ is on the throne. And it's all within his providence and all leading to the new heaven and new earth, no matter what's going on. So,
I've never heard of the word rapture until I came.
it's true. Right.
Talk about it, and I'm like, I don't know.
Well, exactly. And this is a big problem with this view. The book of Revelation hasn't heard the word rapture either. Right? It's not there. Right? The rapture isn't in the book of Revelation, which is a real problem with this system. Also, there's no mention of Israel getting its geographic land back in Revelation, which is just like staggering. Like the whole system is built on these two main pillars of it is that Israel gets its land back and there's a rapture. And neither of those two elements are in Revelation. So what you have to do is you have to import 1 Thessalonians in, where Paul says we're going to be caught up in the air, and like, boom, got it, rapture. But that's assuming you know what a rapture is, right? I fundamentally believe that we will, of course, because the Bible says so, be caught up into the air with Christ. But there's only one second coming, right? So when Christ comes back, it isn't like, come on, everybody, we're getting out of here. Hope everything works out well in the world. That doesn't make any sense. There's 1 second coming, but we're caught up with him for the final battle and the world ends and that's it. There's no like third comings, fourth comings. That doesn't make. No one thought that until very, very, very recently. That's a big, real problems in this system. Further, the idea that we aren't in tribulation now is an idea that only makes sense to a certain kind of Western person in a certain time period, right? So, tell Christians in the Middle East being crucified by ISIS that they're not in the tribulation. Are they not in the tribulation? Yes, they are. They are very much in the tribulation. There's no it's so insulting to a certain extent to say, don't worry, that's not the real tribulation. The real one's coming, and all the good Christians are going to be spared from it. Right? That only makes sense if you live in kind of a comfortable Western world where things are going pretty good. You don't have to worry about being murdered by ISIS on a given basis. You don't have to worry about you're in China and they're going to tear your church down and slaughter your ministers in front of you. You don't have to worry about stuff like that. So you can say stuff like, yeah, the tribulation's a ways off, and we're going to be protected from it, and we're going to be zapped out of it.
That book series.
Right. The Left Behind by Tim LaHaye.
Yeah.
When I was in school. Yeah, exactly.
Something was aborted here, I think.
Yes, indeed.
And Father Wilson.
No.
That's not biblical.
It's just not. And it shouldn't be a surprise to us that a series that they turned into a Nicolas Cage movie perhaps is not the space in which we want to look for real deep theological understandings of things. And this is the case too. The Left Behind series very much popularized this idea as well. That this was the fundamental main way in which Christians thought about the end of the world, and it is a very small voice. And I point back to this 1854 stuff. This is what did Christians think for 1800 years before this thing came about, and that's what we're going to have to be dealing with. That's to me this is a minority report of the way people have thought about the Book of Revelation, but it has massive cultural preeminence right now. Again, because of Scofield Bible, this long history, and also that Tim LaHaye series, which is just kind of ridiculous. We should not look to popular fiction as our main source of, again, he would claim it's historic fiction of things that are going to happen. But it's a bad. Why would we not instead lean on the interpretation of the saints who come before us and look to that, right, as our way of understanding Revelation. I mean, this gets super weird. When I was in high school, I went to a Baptist school, and we watched, and during Bible class, we would watch Left Behind, that movie with Kirk Cameron. That was the first one. Called Left Behind, starred Kirk Cameron, was the star of it, and we watched it, and you were supposed to be taking notes because this was going to happen, right? But that's not the Bible. That's a movie, right? Like, so you were supposed to get ready. Here it comes. You want to make sure if you don't get zapped up, you got to get in the right army of resistance and stuff. Like, oh gosh, it was maddening. And again, in what sense would any of that have made to the original audience or anyone afterwards? Right? It would have made zero sense to them. I mean, I remember my Bible teacher in school telling me, he was pretty sure, because someone asked, well, who's the Antichrist, right? Because there's only one Antichrist, which is weird since John says, so Pope is one. That's a classic example. I'll tell you, my teacher said it was Kofi Annan, who at the time was the UN Secretary General. He's like, I know it. He got up in the word. It's Kofi Annan, who was like, he couldn't run a meeting, much less take over the world. Right? I mean, it's laughable, right? And he just recently died. I saw it in the news and it made me think of it. He died last year. I was like, oh no, the Antichrist. But again, what ends up happening is you just change it up. As soon as one thing doesn't work out, I got another guy. So I've heard people say to me, oh, it's got to be George Soros. He's the Antichrist. And when that guy dies, you know what? It's going to be another guy that they're going to say is the Antichrist. Don't get me wrong. There's definitely going to be sort of a penultimate a man of sorrows, as Paul calls him, right? That comes up. But what John wants us to know in his epistle, right? Like, if we want to know what he means by Antichrist, maybe we go read his actual epistles where he talks about this, as opposed to just going, it's probably Kofi Annan. No, you go, he's always talking about Antichrists, plural, right? And he says, you're surrounded by Antichrists. Anyone who goes against Christ is a Antichrist. So your average person does not need to worry about the man of sorrows at all. What he needs to worry about is all the Antichrists in the world around us, all the time. And that's the real problem of the futurist system, is that it makes us look to this time that's way at the end of things and not think that this book is about us, when it very, very much is. If you told the apostles that they weren't in the tribulation as they were getting their heads cut off, getting beaten to death, getting crucified upside down, they would have said, what the hell are you talking about? This is the tribulation. It's happening right now. Right? Peter says that you're going to go through fire, right? But don't worry, gold makes it through fire. And the fire will show you who's who in the kingdom, right? Don't worry, gold makes it through. His isn't saying, don't worry, if you pray hard enough or if you're good enough Christian, you don't have to go through the fire. That's not what he says at all. He says the fire's coming, but don't worry, you're gold and you'll make it through. Right? That's comfort, because every single person in here is getting some fire, right? Every single person, whether even if we live the most comfortable life in the entire world, and it's just that fire when our bodies betray us and start to murder us, that's fire. That's judgment of sin, right? And if you just go like, well, no, that's not really judgment, or all the minor persecutions of our world now, where everything's trying to get us to deny Christ in little tiny ways, that's all persecution. That's all tribulation. It's all real. This is an ongoing day-to-day fight, which makes so much more sense of when St. Paul talks about put on the armor and go to war every day. Well, why do I need armor if I'm going to be zapped out when the real stuff starts? I don't need armor. I just need to relax because I'm just going to get zapped out and not have to go through anything. No, that's not how any of this works. And that's the real problem. It creates this false idea. And so you'll talk to people who are like, well, I don't really have to live any differently than my neighbors because I believe the right thing, and when the real stuff starts, God's going to zap me out, right? And that it just takes away so much from what Revelation is actually saying, and it subverts the entire message of what it means to be a Christian living in the New Testament. Right? That's its real problem. So it's a little silly. Like, I almost just want to laugh at it sometimes. Like, this is just kind of silly nonsense. And who cares if people think that Kofi Annan is the Antichrist? That's weird, but okay. But the real problem is, and why we kind of have to go hook and tongs on it a bit, is because it leads to a false idea of what it means to be a Christian, and can be a real problem. Don't get me wrong. I think a person can be a classical dispensationalist and be in the kingdom. Absolutely, they can be. This is not a communion-breaking thing. You can say the Nicene Creed and be a dispensationalist, so we're square there. But there is a real horrible danger in taking a book of the Bible and completely missing its purpose and idea. That's a real dangerous thing to do, and it can lead to deficiencies in other areas. Right? So we'll end today on what'll be this is the long-term reading of this book the classical way of reading this book. It goes by different names. I like this name though, the redemptive historical model. That what we're actually looking at here is the entire book is a symbolic presentation of the battle between good and evil. Right. The important thing here is that when we say the word symbolic, we don't make symbolic the enemy of literal. So the futurist or the historicist or even the preterist will say to this model, well, you're just making everything a symbol, so it's not real. We're just reading the Bible. We're just being literal, right? We're just reading the Bible. Chronological, literal, this is what it means. You're the ones just making stuff up, right? That's sort of the same position as someone reading an Agatha Christie novel and saying that that's all real and has to happen. That Agatha Christie isn't writing about human nature and telling us something about ourselves. That breaks down in some sense because here these symbols are connected to real events. They are connected to real things happening. Sometimes, though, those real things are happening in heaven, happening in the spiritual realm, outside of our understanding. So much of what John wants us to know here is that the things happening in heaven, the things happening in the supernatural, are more real and more important than the things happening here and now. So when Domitian thinks he's the emperor and he has all power, he can kill anybody he wants and there'll be no repercussions, in the reality he's nothing and he is going to have to be held accountable for what he's done. He is nothing compared to Christ on the throne. And that's true of every petty despot who thinks that they have power, right? So what else here? The symbols speak over and over again to the events of human history and give an exhortation to all generations to remain faithful in suffering. That's the really key point there. That this book is about us remaining faithful in suffering because it is a book about the church throughout all ages, right? And the symbology here, the symbols that we see, are not exclusively linked to things happening all around us. They are linked to real events, right? But they're events all across the church age, all across history that repeat themselves, right? Mom just made the joke that there's trouble in the Middle East, right? Well, yeah, there's always trouble in the Middle East. There's wars. Jesus was said to be wars and rumors of wars. In what century have there not been wars and rumors of wars? In what century have not had plagues and pestilence, right? All the things that Jesus says will be signs of his return, right? These are all things that happen all the time. He says specifically, you won't know the hour. So if you have a system by which you can say you know the hour, you're screwing up. Right? So you mentioned Israel in 1947. So there are people who say like, oh, I've got the code cracked, right? So it's 80 years after that, and boom, Christ is going to come back. Or it was 40 years first, then it was 60 years, then it was 80 years. And it just keeps getting further the farther we get from 1947 because, spoiler alert, God doesn't really care that much about the UN. That's I mean, don't get me like the UN is not somehow going to move the providential plan of God. Now, God works through all means for his purposes, but the idea that the nation state of Israel is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy is a view that that certain types of Jewish people have. For instance, if you go into the Capitol building in Israel, there's like the prophecy is fulfilled. We got our land back. This is it. It's a lot like the preterist position, actually. That's wrong, but it's just as wrong when an evangelical says, "Boom, 1947 was the fulfillment of biblical prophecy." Right? The Bible's not talking about 1947. What comfort would that possibly give to Jewish people living in the first century who'd become Christians that don't worry, in 1947, they're going to make a political state called Israel again? Who cares? What could that possibly give anybody comfort? It doesn't. It's just a bad system. Instead, what's much, much more important is the idea that God is saving the world on the throne of heaven, right? And you are a part of it. An important part of it. You are the church, living through these ages, living through all this time, intimately connected to the reality that's in heaven, a reality that John tells us is coming to earth. Right? That the vision of the New Jerusalem, not made with hands, coming down to earth to remain forever. That's not a vision of rebuilding the Jerusalem that's there now. Right? It's not a vision of rebuilding the temple. It's not a vision of kicking out the Dome of the Rock and getting Israel back and running. No, it's a vision of a new Jerusalem from heaven, made by God, coming to earth. Right. So if that is our focus, we're working 1,000 times better there. And my final thing on symbology here is we have to take a biblical view of symbols rather than our modern idea of symbols, where symbols are not connected to the things that they symbolize. Right. Someone could say something's a symbol and it just means that the thing's not real, right? For the Bible, that's not the way at all. So when Daniel is our real connective tissue here oftentimes for understanding what's going on. When Daniel will talk about that Nebuchadnezzar's dream is a symbol, he doesn't mean that's not going to happen. Right? So Nebuchadnezzar famously has a dream where this sort of armored figure made out of different pieces of metal is hit by a rock, and the rock destroys all the pieces of metal. And all the pieces of metal represent different kingdoms of the earth. That doesn't mean that there's going to be this big structure that's going to get hit by a rock and then go, whoa, there it is, right? But it does mean that this means something that we have to understand and interpret. And it means a very real thing is coming. But it doesn't give us the timetable for it. It means, of course, that this uncut rock, the altar, the stone that comes down, is going to destroy these kingdoms, and all is going to be left is this ever-growing mountain that is going to be the kingdom of God. Of course, that's all in there, but you gotta interpret that through the symbol being interpreted by Daniel, right? In the same way that, for instance, in the New Testament, all the miracles of Jesus in John's Gospel are called signs, which is the same Greek word we get in the very first chapter, the noun form of what John says in the very first chapter, that he's showing us symbols, right? What signify, right? Are those miracles not real?
No.
Very real, very much happening. The sign is not a thing that isn't happening, right? The sign is very real, but they're signs of God's divine power, right? That have to be interpreted, right? What does it mean that Jesus feeds 5,000 people? Why is that happening, right? That's not an obvious thing for us, unless we go back to the Old Testament and recognize that this is a precursor of the never-ending feast described by Isaiah as the new heaven and new earth. Like, oh, now I know what's going on because I did what? I went back to the Old Testament to figure out what was happening here, because that's my context, instead of saying Jesus just likes to feed people because it's awesome, right? Or I get hungry, Jesus feeds me, Jesus must be great. No, we're getting a picture of the new heaven and new earth, that Jesus is the one who can actually bring it for the first time ever, and that it'll come through him. Right? Boom, that whole passage suddenly explodes. So that's the way Revelation works too. Whenever we get to a weird part of Revelation, like, what the world is this talking about? It's always the case. Go back to the Old Testament, find where else this is talked about, and it just opens up. We completely understand what's happening. Or at least we're in a much better footing than going, Kofi Annan's the Antichrist. Yes, very good.
I got a quick question. Quick. The symbolism of the New Israel, when people came to America, they called it the Promised Land.
Sure.
And
the city upon a hill. It's the shining city on a hill. People still say that, right?
Right. The Promised Land. And so when they got here, your ancestors, the Ellises, named all their kids Bible names. They're Moses and Levi and stuff like that because they thought they made it.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. I mean, you read that in a lot of the literature, and there's a certain sense of you want to. This can get pretty hairy. Like the idea that you'll even read this that America's in the book of Revelation. I've heard this before. America is in it. Like America is great. I love my country, and it's fantastic. And when it does right in a big way. But it's 200 years of this massive big story, right? It's a footnote in this enormous story of the church age, not to mention the story of the entire world, right? So the idea that it has like a starring role in the story of Revelation, or would have made any sense to anybody in the first century? Like, don't worry, there's an America that's coming. Again, I've heard this in people's talking about Revelations. Like, again, it's just one of many things where someone is taking their own experiences and not doing the work, right, of actually trying to figure out what John's talking about through the Bible, right? This is what it means to really use the Bible to understand the Bible, right? Not to just take the passages from Revelation and free associate what they obviously mean. I love it when people say, it obviously means Kofi Annan is the Antichrist. Like, what? How does it obviously mean that? Walk me through that so that we can get there. Show me something other than your fever dreams that tells me this is the answer, as opposed to saying, here's where Daniel, here's where Ezekiel, here's where the prophets of old have mentioned all these things, and John is telling you it's happening now. Here it is. Rejoice, even in death, because you have won in Christ. That's something. That's something you could carry to the cross, which is what many people did after this was written, right? For 300 years after this was written, Christians were still being murdered by the Roman Empire, till the Edict of Milan. Right? So so that lot going on there. So that sort of sets the table for us to get actually into the book itself. But we just want to know what our presuppositions are, and these are mine. These are what I'm bringing to it, and that's why I do. I didn't mention its problem. Its only problem it can have is if we just go all in on, we just sort of ignore the end time stuff, because there is stuff about the end times in here. There really is. It's just not all of the book. It's when we fall into these kind of other camps, that's our real problem. So as long as we don't fall into that.